African history, assimilation policy in Africa. Assimilation policy in Africa. Assimilation was a policy meant to mold the colony in the exact image of the colonial power. It aimed at creating people similar to the French in all aspects except colour. The culture, language, law, civilization, and all aspects of life were to be French and not to be Africans. The word assimilation comes from a French word assimiler, which means to cause to resemble. This policy aimed at turning people of French colonies into French citizens by substituting their indigenous culture with that of the French. The policy had three important features. Administrative assimilation, the phenomenon of establishing administrative identity between colonies, and advance. Political assimilation, sending representatives to French institutions such as Parliament. Economic assimilation, advocated for integration of economic with those of metropolitan France. Why did the French adopt this policy? It was thought best way of undermining some backward tribal tendencies in French West Africa to erase barbaric West African cultures. Long contact of the French in coastal areas of Senegal, i.e. towns of Gori, St. Louis, Rufisque and Dakar. Inhabitants there had been detribalized. People were thought to have adopted French culture and civilization. The policy had economic advantages to France, like properly assimilated people would produce raw materials for French industries and offer market, useful for investment as well as source of employment to the French. French revolutionary ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity were regarded as applicable to all men everywhere. Reason. This is reason as to why French Parliament passed a law granting to those entire practical and civil rights of French citizens. They also believed that their civilization was the best in the world and that it was good for their colonial subjects. This was the view of social Darwinism. Like the Portuguese and Belgians, the French for a long time regarded their colonies as their overseas colonies and not merely colonies for imperial exploitation. The French wanted to create a class of African Frenchmen who would help in developing their colonies socially and economically. Such class would be employed in education, business and administration. French policy had political advantages for the French. A successful assimilation policy would enable France to get permanent overseas colonies for political advantages such as political glory and prestige. Features of French administration in Africa. The French used a centralized system federalism in their administration with its base at Dakar in West Africa. This was because their territory from Senegal to Congo was a consolidated block of land. At the top, there was a Secretary for Colonies resident in Paris, followed by a Governor-General whose headquarters were at Dakar, the capital federal system in West Africa. French Federation was divided into different colonies, each under a lieutenant governor. Again, each colony was divided into provinces called circles, each under a French provincial ruler called commandant de cercle. Below him were chiefs de subdivision at the district level. Important to note that all the upper posts were reserved for the French nationals. The highest post an African could hold was that of canton location leader. Below the location were the village chiefs. African history, assimilation policy in Africa. The French regarded their colonies as overseas provinces. This was basically why they wanted to change them to African Frenchmen. French African kings were seen as obstacles to colonial despotism. The kings could only be maintained if wise they accepted to work as agents of colonial administration. Like the British, the French ruled as much as possible through chiefs, but they eliminated any African leader who proved disloyal to their policies. Kings were deposed or retired in the interests of the French. French administrators had a lot of judicial powers in their colonies. All criminal cases were tried by them and customary laws was ignored except in civil cases. French administrators used 1887 indignant law which allowed them to arrest and punish African subjects without holding any trial. The French used centralized system of administration with its headquarters at Dakar in West Africa. This was important because it ensured that the common aim of France was pursued in all French-controlled territories. The French believed that their culture and civilization were the best in the world. Her people therefore had a mission of admitting all the people, especially those who had no civilization of their own, into their rich heritage. Success of French assimilation case of West Africa. In the first instance, citizenship was granted. For Senegal, inhabitants of the communes of Gori, Dakar, Rufisque and St. Louis were granted citizenship by virtue of birth. Africans in those communes later came to be equipped with French history, literature and morals, which were some of the attributes of assimilation. Consequently, pride in French culture was attained by many, though how this was measured is not known. Also, it is in Senegal that the elective principle was implemented. For example, in 1914, a Senegalese called Blaise Diagne was elected a representative to the French. It should be noted, however, that this elective principle was effected long after 1844 when the Senegalese were declared French citizens. In addition, Diagne went to the lower and not to the upper chamber of the French Parliament. It is therefore not known how long the Africans would take to be fully assimilated into the French political system. From the onset, the French insisted on the use of their language. The French was used in administration even when dealing with Africans. In schools, no teaching was done in vernacular such that African children were forced to learn French from the day they entered school. Even African chiefs were chosen more for their ability to speak French than for any other qualities. In this way, the French were successful in passing on their cultural imperialism. In addition, the system of law used was native justice, but all the same, the French administrators came to wield great judicial powers over Africans. Apart from minor civil cases that were handled by Africans, all criminal cases were under the control of the French. In this way, the French were successful in implementing their judicial code. In pursuance of their policy of equality, freedom, and liberty for all races, the French administration committed itself to the abolition of all forms of slavery and slave trade. Although the French have been accused for having substituted the Surrealist system of slavery with another form of slavery, forced labor, at least by 1914, human trafficking had been out of French West Africa. Failures of assimilation. In the interior, it was discriminatory and defeated its aims. It considered some Africans as French citizens while others as French subjects, a fact that explained their varying privileges and opportunities from the French government. This discredited a policy both in France and in West Africa. The French feared economic and political competition with assimilate Africans. If many Africans acquired citizenship, African history assimilation policy in Africa. The policy was very expensive and considered wasteful of taxpayers' money in France. The French policy of indirect rule, where it was applied, proved cheap and more favorable for colonial exploitation. The policy had opposition from within West Africa. The Muslim communities were hostile to ideas of Catholicism and monogamy. The French found out that deeply rooted African cultures and political institutions in some states could not easily be overthrown in favor of assimilation. The policy was attacked from all corners of France. Scholars in France called it unwise and unrealistic, since it was impossible to convert Africans into Frenchmen. Africans were people of distinct races which needed to be respected. The system of education established did not encourage assimilation because it was in hands of missionaries whose main aim was evangelization. The policy was attacked for lacking foresight. It was argued that it contained seeds of liquidation, as the assimilated would deprive the French of the colonial subjects for exploitation. Due to limited communication owing to the underdeveloped infrastructure, in terms of roads, railways, telegraph lines, and the like, considered decision-making was left to the lieutenant governor of each of the colonies. There was also lack of control of lower African chiefs such as location and sublocation. These were greatly underpaid, which made them develop extrajudicial despotic conduct. Similarities and differences between British and French colonial administrative policies. Similarities. In both, policy-making was done at home by the metropolitan governments. Parliament passed their policies to the colonies through the secretaries for colonies. Local authorities made policies concerning minor issues. Both established new laws based on home judicial systems like the French Code Napoleon and British judicial system were used in settling issues in the colonies. They both undermined the local authorities, and they regulated punishments to local authorities in regard with European statute. Both systems employed Africans at lower levels of administration, like all posts from the district commissioner to governor-general were filled by the British and pure Frenchmen. Both systems were built on fundamental misconception that the Africans were backward in their level of civilization, and the colonial administrative policies were designed to develop Africans. Both had legislative councils. These institutions were initially established by the British, but later the French also developed them. They were meant to enact some laws and take them for approval in metropolitan colonial offices. Both failed to achieve what they were set to do. Indirect rule failed to preserve traditional institutions, while assimilation was abandoned in favor of association. Both systems used indirect and direct rule. They employed traditional chiefs to govern on their behalf. Whereas there were no recognized chiefs, both appointed their own chiefs, thus making it direct rule. Like in eastern Uganda, the British used direct rule, and in West African towns like Kajina, Lagos, Freetown. In both, chiefs were not answerable to their colonial masters. The French and British had no respect for traditional authority in African societies. The French had no respect monarchs, they undermined them. Similarly, the British destroyed powers of some African leaders like Asantehene and Asante Empire. Both survived on colonial exploitation based on taxation and forced labor. In both, African local leaders. African history assimilation policy in Africa. Differences. The French established a highly centralized and authoritarian administration. The French administered all their colonies as a federation under a governor-general at Dakar, under whom was a hierarchy of officials in each colony. The British, on the hand, established a separate administration in their colonies, i.e., British colonies were administered independent from the other and got orders from the Secretary for Colony based in London. Assimilation was more expensive in terms of manpower requirement and financial costs than British indirect rule. The French emphasis on employment of French citizens, including those who were assimilated, was more costly than British employment of traditional or local chiefs who in actual sense paid himself through locally generated revenue. The British tried to use indirect rule and respected traditional customs and leaders, while the French tried to use assimilation policy that never had such characteristics. The British respected traditional methods of choosing chiefs and respected rules of succession. The French, on the other hand, chose their own leaders whom they posted in French West Africa. Hence, local chiefs and the French were nominees who lacked traditional approval from French citizen group. They differed in their attitude towards colonies. While the British regarded them as separate entities, the French regarded them as overseas provinces. The French policy led to creation of French citizens, while the British made no attempt to turn Africans into British. Assimilated Africans enjoyed all the rights and privileges of French citizens. Africans were also allowed to have representatives in French National Assembly. The British system of administration did not provide for anything of this nature. Unlike assimilation that aimed at destroying African cultural and social institutions, indirect rule did not attack African cultures and social life, at least directly. This was probably because of British superiority complex and fear of devastating African society in process of cultural intermixture. British had respect and fear of African cultures. African chiefs under the British enjoyed more power and authority than those of the French. Whereas both used chiefs to collect taxes, the British allowed some control of finance to local chiefs, while the French took away all the revenue and used it the way they chose. In French West Africa, all revenue was collected to the central/federal pool treasury, Dakar. It was the duty of the Governor-General to use it for the benefit of the colonies. On the other hand, each colony in British West Africa managed to own financial resources. Therefore, the development of each colony depended on the revenue collected. In French West Africa, development was more equitable because revenue was shared according to the need of each colony. The British, unlike the French, did not attempt to pass laws in English legislature for all their African colonies or protectorates. Instead, the governor of each territory drew up laws according to the area under his authority. However, it is vital to recognize the fact that laws made in British colonies and protectorates had to be approved by the British Secretary of State for colonies based in London. He could pass it, amend, criticize, or cancel it down.